Hello guys, and welcome back to the Summer Day Studios YouTube channel. In today's video, we're going to be taking a bit of a step back and looking at one of the most important parts of working with materials in Maya, that being the Hypershade editor. So we've used the Hypershade editor a fair few times now in previous videos to create shaders and effects, like recently with the triplanar projection and metal shader tutorials. But this time we're going to focus on the basics. So if you're new to Maya or just starting out with rendering in Maya and creating materials and you're not sure how to use the Hypershade editor, then we're going to give you a bit of a basic foundation for understanding how nodes work and how to use them and how to create a simple material or set up at least the basics of a simple material in the Hypershade editor. So where to connect things and what everything does. Or what most things do, because it can get quite complicated. So we'll just start with the basics for today's video and then probably expand upon it in a later one. So yeah, a lot of beginners struggle with the Hypershade editor since it can be quite daunting, I'm sure. It was for me when I first started. There's a lot of different elements that might not seem obvious or intuitive if you've never actually created a material before. So don't worry, we'll start from basically the beginning. So to open the Hypershade editor, once you're in Maya, you're going to go to the top here, kind of the top middle of the screen, and you're looking for this little blue ball. It has a bit of a white circle in it as well. So if you just click that, it's going to open up a new window that looks like this. There's a lot of different areas we use in this, a lot of things to look at, but the main ones we're going to be looking at today is kind of just this graph here, this grid, and some of this on the left-hand side and right-hand side as well. Don't worry so much about what all of this is up here for the time being. So just to briefly explain what the Hypershade editor actually is, so it allows you to create, edit, and manage materials, shaders, and textures for your 3D models, and it's a node-based workspace. And by node-based, what I mean is you essentially create nodes or individual parts, if you like. Think of it kind of like Lego, and they connect together in various different ways. It lets you visually connect different elements like image textures, colors, and properties to build materials. Think of it kind of like Maya's material laboratory in a way, where you can see how everything interacts and just kind of fine-tune your surfaces and your materials for when they're rendered. So let's actually start by doing something practical and create your first shader, your first material. So to do that, we could start out by clicking something on the left-hand side here, and there's a million different things here if I just scroll down the list. A lot of these you won't need to worry about, to be honest. Frankly, you might not even end up using most of these. I definitely don't, doing the vast majority of my work in Maya. But to begin with, let's just create something simple. Let's click on the Lambert here, and that's just under the Maya section here. If you haven't got this same menu up, just click Maya here, and then click on Lambert. So whenever you create a shader in Maya, it's going to end up looking something like this. So this is just a default Lambert material. It comes pre-bundled with Maya. It's quite an old material at this point, but it has a few different inputs. You can see these kind of red and green colored circles here, and it's connected to this blue box over here as well, as in it has two separate nodes. I can just left click these and drag these around, and this is what I was talking about with the visual element of it. You can see what's connected to what, you know, and you can move these around, and regardless of where you move these, if you wanted to organize this and make it tidy, you can see that this out color is still connected to the surface shader of this blue box here. And with this material selected, on the right-hand side, you can see we have a few different things to change here. So we have color, transparency, ambient color, and incandescence. So we won't get into what all of these are at the moment, but basically these kind of settings here within a shader are the building blocks or the instructions of any material that you make. And we'll get into that in a little bit. So you might be wondering what a shader is and what a material is. So a shader, in kind of as little words as possible, is essentially a set of instructions that tells your computer how to or how a surface should look when it's rendered. It controls the things like color, reflectivity, transparency, and how light will interact with the material to create realistic or stylized results depending on your preference and settings. A shader is kind of like the inner workings of a material. So what's a material? A material is where you it's what you apply to a 3D object to define its overall look and surface qualities. It combines shaders, image textures, and settings to control how the object reacts to light. So in a way, it's basically the shader is kind of like the recipe, and the material is a finished dish that you apply to your model, so to speak, if that makes sense. So now that you know how to create a new shader, Let's go ahead and create one a little bit more complex. And we're using Arnold for this. Arnold just comes prepackaged with Maya, but you can use any other render engine as well that you like Pixar's RenderMan or Corona or anything like that. Essentially, they're all going to be the same fundamentally. They all work a little bit differently and have their own pros and cons, but the things I'm going to be explaining in today's video are applicable to all of those. They might just have slightly different names and placements depending on the render engine you use. But yeah, we're going to be using Arnold. So just left click and drag. We'll delete this Lambert for the time being. And instead of creating our shader from the left-hand side here, we're instead going to press Tab. And that's going to bring up a little search box here. In the search box, we can type in the name of the shader we want to create. So we're going to create an Arnold-specific one that's called an AI Open PBR Surface. And you can see here it's auto-filled, right, once we typed in enough. A lot of people see this and they think AI, it means artificial intelligence. It actually doesn't. AI just is kind of a wording for Arnold. But once we create this, you can see it looks like the Lambert, but there's a lot more green and red circles, a lot more inputs. It still has the out color just plugged into the surface shader, right? But there's a hell of a lot more instructions and settings that we can change here. And you can see that reflected on the right-hand side as well in the attribute editor on this side. And there's a lot of different tabs for transmission and all sorts of things. But let's just take a look at some of these, the kind of the core ones that you're going to be using for the vast majority of your work. And at least the basic ones that you need to get up and running, creating your first material with the Hypershade editor. So before we do that, just so you can visualize how these changes work, let's just minimize that for the time being, and that will just come down into a separate window down here that you can bring back at any time. Let's create a cube, just as our test subject to render with. I'm just going to scale it up a little bit, and I'm also just going to go ahead and create a light. For today's video, we're going to be using a sky dome light instead of any other kind of light, because we're going to be looking at a few things that require a kind of background reflected environment. To do that, we're going to be using an HDRI image. You can get those from websites for free, like Polyhaven or Ambient CG. I have downloaded a lot in my time, and I'll give you links to those in the description. Let's quickly go to one of those sites just to show you where you can get these from. So I've just gone to ambientcg.com, and in here, once you're on the website, if you go to environments, you can have a bunch of different ones here, and there will all be different scenes from, you can see here there's kind of like a nice sunset on a grassy plain, a sunny beach scene, night sky even, and some interiors too. If you were to just click one of these, you can download it in different resolutions. I wouldn't go any higher than 4K just for testing. 8K is going to get a bit heavy. But you could just download a 4K one here. Generally, I like to download the HDRI instead of the JPEG. It just is a bit more, has a bit more detail and is a bit more usable. But you can use both for this video if you like, more for this tutorial. Anyway, once you've downloaded that, come back to Maya. With your sky dome light selected on the right-hand side, just go to color, press that little square, and then under image name, press this little file icon, and just navigate to where you stored your HDRI. I've got some prepared already, and I'm just going to go ahead and add those. And what I'm going to do is, so that we can preview how our material looks in the viewport, I'm just going to press this little button here that looks like a light bulb, and that will preview the lighting for us. And you can see here we're now seeing that in real time within Maya. They've just added that semi-recently, or at least the ability to preview materials accurately in Maya, if you have one of the later versions. So once we have this turned on, I also like to reduce the, if you click on the sky dome light again, scroll down and go to viewport and change the radius to 0. That way we can't see it and our background's a little less cluttered. Okay, what we're going to do now is come back to the Hypershade editor and click on our shader. And then we're just going to minimize this. And the reason we've done that is so that once we've clicked on it in the Hypershade editor, we now have it, all the settings visible in the right-hand side of the attribute editor here. If you don't have the attribute editor open, just click it down here on the right-hand side. And we're going to adjust all of these so we can get to what each element is, or the main ones that you'll be using. So the first one is color. So the color, as you might expect, nice and simple. It just defines the base color of your material. This can either be a flat color, like a kind of whitish gray in this case, or it can also be a image texture, which we'll get to later. So if I was to just click here on the color, it will bring up a color wheel and various different things we can change. We could make this red. First things first, actually, you need to apply your material. If you try to change the color and you see your model is still white, that's because the material has not been applied to your model. So click your cube, hold down right click, go to assign existing material, and then click on your AI Open PBR surface that you created. Okay, and now we can just select our shader from the list up here. So if I change this color here, you can see now we can make it whatever we want, from purple to blue to green and yellow. I think for the time being, I'll just go with a blue. The next thing on the list as well is metalness. So metalness, again, as you might expect, kind of adjusts how metallic an object looks. A value of 0 will mean no metalness whatsoever. A value of 1 will mean entirely metal. And you can see now as I put that to 1, the surface now looks a lot more metallic. We're getting the reflections of our HDRI. That's why I thought it was a good idea to use that today to demonstrate this. And you can even have this at like a half value if you want to have a little bit of metalness. It's really up to you depending on what kind of material you're trying to make. We then also have roughness. By default, this is always at 0.3. So the lower this is, the more reflective it's going to be, right? If I put this at a value of 0, it's going to be a lot more like a mirror. And you can even see that reflected here, kind of like the metalness. We can see a perfect reflection of the windows in our HDRI environment. So this is a bit more like a mirror. If I was to put this all the way up to 1, this is kind of, well, if I was to render this, it would be more like concrete, essentially. You would get no reflections here whatsoever. It would just be very, very rough, dry looking material. So depending on what kind of material you want to make, let's say you were going for like a whiteboard or like a shiny plastic, you might have this a bit lower. But if you were creating a brick, for example, you could have this much higher. But again, you can also plug image textures into the roughness and the metalness as well, and most other nodes as well. These little squares here, if you were to click those, that would allow you to do that, but we'll get to that in a minute. One of the last and most important parts we can look at here is if you click the geometry drop down here, there's a input for bump mapping, okay? Now we can use either a bump map or a normal map. They're both a little bit different, but essentially achieve the same thing. But a normal map allows you to add fine surface detail like wrinkles, pores, that sort of thing, scratches, without actually changing the geometry of your model. It's all just texture information and uses clever tricks of the light in the render engine to mimic actual physical model detail when there actually is none. And it's very, very useful for adding small details like pores and scratches when you don't necessarily want to model those in just because it's too time consuming, or if you're doing low poly stuff, for example. So like I was saying, you can manually adjust all of these settings yourself, but let's say instead you wanted to use image textures. How do you do that? Well, those sites that I mentioned earlier, like Polyhaven and Ambient CG, they provide a lot of free materials. So we'll come back to Ambient CG and we're going to go to surfaces, and you can see we have a huge list of different materials. Pick whichever one you like, okay? It's up to you. Just for ease of use, I think I'm going to pick this brick material here, or maybe one of these, maybe this one. And you can pick whatever resolution you like, 1K, 2K. The higher the resolution, the more detailed it's going to be. I wouldn't go with 8K just because the file size is a bit larger, and most of the time is unnecessary unless you're doing some really specific close-up stuff. So I'm just going to download the 2K one for the time being, and then give that a moment to download. And then go ahead and find where you've downloaded that and store that, unzip it in a place that makes sense to where you can remember. I like to keep all of my materials in a folder within my Maya project folder. And I have them all broken down into different categories like man-made, natural, and so on. But as long as you have it somewhere where you know you can come back to it. Okay, so I'm going to pick up one of these brick materials that I have. And I just like to copy the path to this so that I can refer back to it later, because we're going to need that in a moment. So I'm just going to press Control-C there to copy that. And then we're going to open the Hypershade editor back up. Okay. And we're going to create a new node this time. We're going to press Tab and type in File. So, and specifically a File texture node. There is a file stencil and projection, but we want the texture node. Okay. Now, what this allows you to do is, as the name suggests, add a file into your Hypershade editor. And we're going to use those image textures that we just downloaded. So over on image name here, click on this folder, and then we're now going to paste the link that we have for our material. And we're going to take the diffuse. The diffuse is just the color information, nothing else. It has no shadow, no roughness or anything like that. It's literally just color. And I'm going to click open. Okay, and now, like you have on your material here, the open PBR surface, we have different colored circles here as well. In this case, we just have 2 green ones and this white one, but you don't really need to worry about that. We have out alpha and out color. What we're looking for here is, as you might have guessed, out color. And you might be wondering, where does that go? Well, it goes into the out base color. When you go to plug things in, you can see here, some things you can't plug it into. It will just gray out. If I was to try and plug it into here, for example, it wouldn't do anything. But if we plug it into the base color, it allows us to do that, and it then connects up with this green line. Okay? If I were to come back to my scene and just click on this textured button here, that will now display our image texture on our model. So instead of just being plain gray and adjusting it with the slider here, you can now see that's grayed out in the attribute editor because we have an image texture applied, right? And that's driving the color instead. We can do the same thing as well for the roughness. If I go ahead and press tab and create another file node, this time we're going to take a roughness map, and you can see here that's just black and white. Okay, that's because this isn't actually giving us any color information. It's more of a it's more like number information, if that makes sense. So you know how the slider was going from, 0 to 1. If you imagine the color here, the black and the white, or the gray and the white, it can go to black, like a gradient. White being 1, or the most rough, and black being 0, or the least rough, right? If you imagine the 1 is kind of like brick, and the 0 is like the mirror. These different colors are just different values along that range. Okay, and it tells our shader, it tells our material how rough each area should be based on this image file. For this, we need to plug this into the specular roughness here, okay? And you might think because this is a green circle and this is a green circle, we can just plug that in, but no, you can't. You can see it grays out. That's because, like I was saying, we don't actually want the color information here, okay? We just want the alpha information, or alternatively, you can just take out the out color red. That's generally what I do. And you can just plug that into the specular roughness like so. On its own though, that will not work. There's a few different things you need to change here. Under color space, default that will be sRGB. You need to change that to utility and then raw, okay? And then you need to take alpha is luminance. All that does is essentially it tells Maya and Arnold that we don't want to use color information here. We want to use those values, right? The value between 0 and 1 or black and white. Once we have that plugged in, we're not actually rendering here, so you can't tell as well how much of an effect that is having. But if we click our model, you can see here the roughness also has been grayed out. We can't adjust this slider anymore. And this box here as well has also become yellow. It still says 0, but don't worry, it's not. It's just, that's just how it works. There is a material, or there is an image texture applied. Okay, and the last one we mentioned as well was the normal map. So we can create another file texture. And this time we're going to take the normal map. So we'll go back to where we kept our image textures, and we'll take the normal here. And you can see here, this looks like some kind of like kaleidoscope of blues, greens, and pinks and purples. This special texture, like I said, is going to tell Arnold essentially this information will tell it to add bumpiness to it. And you'll see what I mean by that in a second. But we can't just plug this directly into the normal camera. I mean, we could, but on its own, it won't do anything. We need another node, okay? We're going to press tab again. I'm going to type in AI normal. And you can see here we have a node called AI normal map, okay? And this will go between our file node containing our normal map image texture and our material here, the OpenPBR surface. So we're going to take the out value from the normal map and plug that into the normal camera. And then we're going to take the out color and plug that into the input. Okay? And like we did with the roughness texture, we're going to change the color space of the normal image texture down here from sRGB to utility and then raw. We don't actually need to have alpha is luminance for this. If you were to take that on, this wouldn't work. So that's just 3 important things to remember here. With the color, we just plug it straight in. You don't have to change anything. With the roughness, you have to check color space to raw and alpha is luminance. And then with the normal, you just check color space raw and nothing else. Okay, and again, you won't be able to see that in your scene, but because we have a light in our scene, we can go ahead and actually render this. If you come up to render and then go to Arnold, and then give that a minute just to render. It might take a couple minutes depending on your computer. Okay, it will then start rendering, and you can see here now this is a much rougher material. We're not really getting any reflections here, and you can see we're also getting our normal map is starting to take effect. You can see it looks like there's actually detail modeled into the model, right? It's looking quite bumpy and harsh and sharp like bricks, and that's because the normal map's responsible for that. So you can see these are kind of the basics of creating a shader, or a material. You can adjust the sliders, you can plug image textures in, and the main ones you really want to look out for when you're just beginning is the base color, the specular roughness, and the normal. Those three things combined, as you can see here, can create something quite nice. And yeah, so that's a basic introduction to the Hypershade editor and how to use it to create some basic materials. We'll probably do another video later on just to go into a bit more detail and explain what a lot of these other nodes are and how to use those. But to begin with, this is just enough to get you started. I would say play around with this, see what you can create with those free materials, and yeah, have fun with it as well. And if you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to ask. Always open to questions. And yeah, let us know what you'd like to see next as well. That's been really nice. We've had a lot of people giving us ideas, telling us what they'd like to see, which has been really good. And I'm always happy to make those as well from the suggestions. So yeah, thank you very much for watching. Like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.